Welcome everyone to another episode of the Compliance Chronicles. Today we are joined by a very exciting guest, at least for us in the compliance world. Before I do that, Ray has aggressively reminded me to tell everyone, don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, check your notifications.
Hi.
Um, yes, look, he's already in my ear telling me, don't forget to press the hype button on YouTube because that helps us reach more viewers. But of course, only if you like the content. Don't just do it because I'm telling you to do it, which probably is good for the discussion that we're going to have today. Um, so today we're joined by a guest, Christian Hunt, who I'm going to read out what I've written down just because I don't want to miss anything because it is very important that I get this across. Um, so Christian Hunt founded Human Risk, which is a consultancy and training firm focused on utilizing behavioral science within organization. And also, for those of you who haven't watched it, has an incredible podcast also titled Human Risk, I believe. So first off, welcome. And I'm going to start immediately with a question, which is, what is behavioral science? It's a big thing that I've seen all across your LinkedIn. I've seen you talk about it in your podcast. So for our listeners who aren't aware, what is behavioral science?
Sure. So behavioral science is the science of understanding what drives human decision making, right, which is really what makes us tick. And so the reason I'm interested in it is if we look at compliance as the objective of influencing humans, bearing in mind if you want an organization to be compliant, the way you get that is you get the people within it to do the things you want, not do the things you don't, and magically the organization becomes compliant. If we're in that business, then it's a good idea to understand what makes people tick. And the reason behavioral science is fascinating is that often the things that we think drive our decision making don't. There's lots of factors that come into play. And if we can understand those, we can design programs that are more effective.
Sounds so simple. It does sound so simple. But why do you believe that there aren't many firms that actually follow this? That when they see people doing something wrong, it's okay, here's another policy, here's another procedure. Why is that the automatic reaction to that?
Because behavioral science, on the one hand, is incredibly simple, right? We're all humans. We understand it. We all interact with each other. We're trying to influence other people. We are influenced by other people. But in practice, that requires you to think a little bit because often what drives decision making are not the things that we'd like to admit it. So if we look at advertising, for example, many things are advertised in ways that make no sense whatsoever. So if we think about in the UK, price comparison websites advertised by opera singers and talking meerkats. Why would you take advice from either of those people on what insurance to buy? And yet it works. So that tells you that we're not always logical, rational people. We buy things for all kinds of reasons. And we're influenced by all sorts of things, sometimes things we wouldn't want to admit to. Getting underneath that and working that out is a little bit of an effort, requires us time and effort. And it's much easier to do things that are logical and sensible. And so what I'm proposing is something that's quite disruptive, which is to say that we should look at whether the methods we're using actually work the way we think they do. Now, that requires you to recognize that you might not have been doing it the right way up until now, and some uncomfortable truths that actually whisper it. Compliance programs can make things worse. Right? We like to think of a compliance intervention like a policy or a training. Well, it must be an unalloyed good, right? It must be delivering the right outcome. But actually, if you look at it, we can make things worse, right? We can annoy people, we can confuse them, we can create complexity that isn't actually there. And so as I look at it, what I'm doing is kind of unpicking and saying, is this compliance stuff doing what we think it's supposed, is it actually doing what we think it's doing? And in many cases, the answer is no. And we could sometimes do less of it. The natural tendency when something's gone wrong is do more. So we'll add more policies, more rules every time there's something that goes wrong. But if we take that logic, what happens if the thing that we've been doing up until now is part of the problem? More training. If the training's not helping, doing more of it is going to make things worse. But the natural solution is we need to be seen to be doing something. And so doing nothing doesn't feel like an option. Taking things away feels like you're taking more risk. So the natural tendency is just to add more to it, because then you can say, well, we've added these extra things. But my contention is that's not always going to deliver the outcomes you want.
Thank you for that intro, Christian. So let's strip back for a second then. If we look at regulation which drives compliance standards, there's often an assumption that creating more rules creates improved behaviors and improved compliance. But I'm guessing that your stance is often contrary to that. So my question first is why do regulators then have that opinion? And then what would be the next step for them to align to a better approach?
So I'm really harsh on regulators, but I say that as a former regulator.
Yeah.
So I've kind of sat there and
Yeah.
and been through that experience. And again, the things I talked about that compliance officers have, this challenge of we need to be seen to be doing something. We need to react to what's happened. The tendency is you want to show something. And an extra rule sort of suggests that you've solved the problem. You've at least gone through the exercise. You've concluded that something needs to happen. You've done something. And so that's easy to justify. And so when we think about regulators, they're often subject to political pressure. We think about in the UK, the Treasury Select Committee is a good example of where financial services regulators have to show up and account for themselves. It's a much easier narrative to say we've introduced some extra rules than we've done nothing at all. So the same pressures that compliance officers are under, regulators are also under, but they're having to do it in public. And of course, they're having to take responsibility for something. Ultimately, they're not the actors in the game, whereas compliance officers at least have some degree of control within the organization. So I have a huge amount of sympathy for regulators, except I think that we know now that the additive approach of more and more rules, we know that doesn't always work. And so I spend a lot of time with regulators. I say to them, look, you've got to recognize two things. One is if you genuinely want to be effective, then have a look at how effective what you're doing is. And we've got enough of a track record now to know certain things don't work as well as we think. But the second thing is you set the tone for the industry. So if you're a regulator piling on the rules, the natural tendency, it's almost like a parent-child thing, the natural tendency for compliance people is to go, okay, that's how we solve this problem. And even if the compliance people don't believe it, if you as the regulator have sort of demonstrated that's how you think of the world, of course they're going to do that. Right? So I think it's just because we're kind of lazy. It's easier to go down this tried and tested route. And so we end up with this kind of we end up with this massive amount of regulation. And then people go, whoa, what the hell happened there? We've got too many rules. Let's pare it back. And then we probably go the other way, right? We get rid of all the rules and we're back to and it builds up again. So there's a sort of cyclical nature to it.
Yeah.
I have so many follow-up questions. Can I just ask one question? So you mentioned the pressure that regulators have from governments, policies, from politicians, etc. Do you think the same apply? I mean, you mentioned it, but from a compliance perspective. So, I'm a compliance officer. Sometimes I know that there's an expectation from the business that you're the compliance guy. You need to know what to do. You need to tell us what rules to follow.
Yeah.
And that is almost forcing my hand to say, well, I know that I should really remove the policy procedure and I shouldn't do another training course. However, the business is expecting something here. Do you think that pressure sometimes causes us to react that way?
Oh, totally. I mean, if you think about it, ultimately, there's a weird thing here, which is the business pays for compliance. So in theory, compliance is supposed to be an independent function that challenges the business, but who pays the bills, right? It's the business itself. So there's always that particular tension. And how will they judge what you're doing? Well, they will have a preconceived notion as to what a good compliance function would look like. So there's simultaneously an expectation that you do stuff, but also they kind of want to try and game you a little bit because naturally, often when we're intervening in a compliance context, we tend to be stopping things that would naturally happen, right? If people naturally do the right thing, we don't need to have rules, we don't need to have training, it just happens. So typically when we're intervening, it's making them do something they wouldn't otherwise do or not do something they would like to do. And so there's this tension between, on the one hand, they want to be seen to have a sensible compliance function. On the other hand, you're the game that they're trying to play. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely pressure from the business. And again, if you're trying to justify your existence, what are you spending your time doing? And I think one of the biggest challenges for compliance is what does good look like? Well, the answer is nothing goes wrong, right? So how do you evidence success? Nothing has gone. That doesn't feel very compelling. That just feels like, well, they haven't done anything, right? And perfect compliance actually is often invisible, right? Processes that are just so natural, so built into the business, nobody notices they're happening. A bit like, we all find ourselves in sort of airport situations where they very cleverly manipulate us, right, to walk a particular way or to get to the gate on time. Often we don't notice those things are happening. And so I think the measure of success of compliance being invisible, no outcomes, is a bit of a problem. So how do we deal with that? Well, the answer is we're seen to do loads of things.
You look like you were going to say something that I interrupted you.
No. I was going to say something. It was around going back to the political public pressures. And then if we're looking at that then, and I agree because that was actually one of my questions, whether political and public pressure is actually inhibiting regulators to make better decisions on regulation or forcing through regulation. But then if we're looking at over the last 2 decades or so, or even 3 decades, you're seeing like the expansion of regulatory frameworks and legislative frameworks. If the legislator themselves is the government or is a political party, so why is it that they are then making more rules? If they're the ones that actually are laying down the requirements, why themselves are they then making more rules?
Well, we could start by blaming the general public, right? So typically something goes wrong. Let's think of the water industry in the UK, right? So there's been a big problem with sewage in rivers. We don't like that. We demand action is taken. And so what would action look like? Well, the answer is it's fines, it's more regulations, it's more restrictions. We want something to be done about it. And so we have a preconceived notion as to what that might look like. What would we expect to see? And so you sort of see politicians responding to that because that's how you get elected, and politicians then put the pressure on regulators to be seen to be doing something. So you can sort of, I mean, you could almost in a way it starts with us, right? We get the regulation that we demand and expect. And of course, in some cases, we do need extra rules, right? There are situations that haven't been contemplated. Sometimes they should have been contemplated. So I would argue that putting the water industry into sort of private equity ownership, what are they going to do? Answer is cut costs, not invest at all. So that the outcomes that we're seeing in that industry kind of obvious. But let's imagine that let's be charitable here and say that the regulators didn't see that coming, didn't have the foresight, then action does need to be taken. So sometimes adding rules does serve a valuable purpose, but it's a sort of just this the knee-jerk reaction. General thing. So we expect action. Politicians want to be seen to be tough on things. And you think about the number of times you get politicians saying tough on this.
Yeah.
That naturally, what does that mean? Well, tough doesn't sound like let's have less rules. Tough sounds like more rules, bigger fines, greater consequences. So we're kind of clamoring for it, and we perhaps shouldn't be surprised when we get what we want. So part of what I'm trying to do is to sort of say we need to be a bit more intelligent when we think about rules. So I step back from kind of the compliance topic and look broadly at rules and how do they work and how do they operate in contexts that have nothing to do with compliance, but it's all the same thing. It's a human interaction with people telling us to do or not do something.
We have that. We work quite heavily in the gambling industry, and that example you gave there is most of our listeners will be able to relate to, because looking at the UK as an example, the moment over the last decade or so, even longer, suicide rates from gambling harm and just general gambling harm has gone through the roof, which, like you say, public outcry led to the UK regulator enforcing more rules and harder fines on people. But what actually it's done is it's made it harder for operators to comply with the new rules, because it's almost as though they've been rushed out to, like you say, meet public demand. But then who watches the watchman? Who tells the regulators this is a bad idea? Because there's nobody in government that's going to say, we want you to be tougher. However, take your time with it. Get this right. Speak to professionals. It's like you say, we want you to be tougher. You've got a year or 6 months or whatever it is. So how can we change that? I know they've got people like you speaking to them, but is there anything more that we can do as people that are within firms in compliance positions?
It's tough, right? Because if you're involved in the, let's call it the game for fun, right? If you're involved in the game on some level, you're setting the rules, or you're responsible for supervising firms, or you're responsible for enforcing against them, you're kind of involved in this whole loop. So I think there are smart regulators that have kind of created subunits that go in and look and say, did we get that right? So internal review can be quite helpful, but again, it's internal review within the organization. I mean, you've got bodies like the National Audit Office, but they tend to focus on value for money, as opposed to is this an effective outcome? I'd say the best possible force for good in these things is one, academia, where you've got lots of people studying this stuff and looking at does it actually work with the way we expect it. Now, it's sometimes hard to translate what academics come up with into real world findings and explain it to people, and sometimes what they come up with feels counterintuitive, right? Less rules, it's going to be a hard sell, but so there's that. And I think journalists play a really, really important role in asking huge questions about things and challenging from that front. But naturally, the way the system is set up, if we had a function that reviewed a sort of regulator of regulators, that would immediately fall foul to, well, this feels like a waste of money. Why do we need this? Why can't they do their job properly? But you're right. I mean, if you wanted to do it, that would be the smart way to handle it. I mean, I think to a certain extent, you've got international bodies help, where we sign up to international standards. So to the extent that those exist and are sensible, we can see that at least that's knocking us in the right direction. But in a world where governments are pushing towards less and less regulation, in the UK, we've got this big thing about growth, without any no one specified what that means.
Yeah.
Well, what kind of growth are you looking for? What's the risk appetite in relation to that? When you've got that sort of thing, having someone else coming in and sort of saying, "Are you doing an effective job?" becomes a countervailing narrative. So it's a bit challenging. But yeah, ideally, you'd have a regulator of regulators.
Yeah.
So this is a good discussion, and things that confuses me. Sorry, one thing that confuses me is that there's a consensus that good regulation doesn't necessarily mean more rules, but better rules. But then why is the narrative or the assumption points between the regulators being focusing on rules and sanctions so diverged from like a behavioral model, where actually it's not about rules and regulation and sanctions. It's more about clarity of rules. It's more about incentivization. It's more about actually, is this applicable in the real world? Why then is there such a disparity between actually everyone knowing what good looks like, but then actually the understanding of it being so far apart?
Well, so what you've talked about there with things like rules and it's really easy to measure inputs.
Yeah.
It's much harder to measure outcomes because we come back to that. What does good look like? Well, nothing goes wrong at all. Nothing happens. Nothing to see here. So what do we turn towards? Well, the answer is if we want to describe how effective we have been, we talk about the things that we have done. And so that will be those clunky things where it's obvious that there's something there. But generally, those, that's an input to the process. And so the narrative revolves around that because it's easier to talk about that. I think the challenge with the sorts of things that I'm trying to get across and sort of say, look, we need to look not at inputs, but at outputs. What's the outcomes that we're getting? Is this working the way we think it is? Is that requires you to sort of go back, step back, analyze the situation, work out what's working and not working, probably admit that some of the things that you've been doing are either ineffective or whisper, even making things worse. That's a heck of an ask. And so I have to, in a way, I have to use behavioral science to sell behavioral science. So I have to recognize that if I'm turning around saying, you should be thinking more behaviorally, right? If we're trying to influence human beings, I have to recognize that I am, in order to get that message across, I am having to influence the human beings that are already involved in the system. And so one of the things that we know is that people don't like change. People don't like being embarrassed. People like an easy way out of things. And so the easiest narrative is look at all these things we've done, and particularly where they fit a conventional narrative, right? Stuff that is easily justifiable and auditable. Whereas some of the outcomes that we're looking for can be a bit messy. And of course, what you're pointing towards, Ray, is trust.
Yeah.
This comes down to a relationship of trust. And one of the things we know is that industries where the regulator and the regulatees are trusted, let's take the airline industry, for example, there's a degree of trust there. Now, that's helped by the fact that when things go wrong, I'm thinking in the air as opposed to on the ground. When things go wrong in the airline industry, that has life or death consequences. So that's serious stuff. So the airlines are incentivized to make sure they're safe, and the regulators. So there's a sort of alignment of interest there that doesn't always exist in other industries. But there's a real degree of trust there to the extent that you get into more trouble for not reporting stuff than you do for reporting stuff. And they recognize that things are going to go wrong, and it's a good idea to share information, but it starts from a basis of trust. And we've lost that, if we ever had it, in a ton of other industries. Now, we can say, for example, financial services, you can go, well, why would we trust them? Look what that industry's done. So we start from a difficult position of a checkered past, but we need that element of trust. And when that element of trust isn't there, what do we do? Well, we recognize we don't trust these people. We're going to put in place more and more controls. So a lot of the heavy-handed regulation basically is saying we don't trust you.
Yeah. One of the points you made there about when you were talking about trust, one of the things I was thinking was when it comes to regulators, we've had incidents in the past where we've been subject to a compliance assessment from a regulator, and it's gone really, really well. And we've had discussions with the regulator to say, look, you've given us almost a gold star to say this was a great assessment. Can you feed this back to the industry? Let them know what went well so they can replicate it, because they'll learn more than if this went bad and you find us and tell them, here you go, here's another business that's been fined 20 million. They don't learn much from that. But if you go out and say, they done this well, try and copy them, etc., or take some learnings from it. They didn't do it. They said they were going to, but then they didn't do it. Is that psychology on that part? Are they trying to play some game, or do you think that's just a case of, well, no, we want people to get it wrong because...
Well, I think, so let's be sympathetic to them and then let's go to the other side. So the sympathetic answer is, there's a risk there. If you go, Alex's firm has done a stellar job, like these people are amazing, do what they do. What happens is everybody in the industry then goes, oh, well, we'll just copy what they've done. And you get that same dynamic that you get with best practice, right? Everybody in the industry, everybody gravitates towards that one thing. Now, if that one thing turns out to have a flaw in it, and particularly where we're dealing with tech companies, you can sort of see that dynamics can shift. New tech, AI would be a really good example, right? Something that comes over the head. Now, everybody in the industry predicts it, but maybe if you're regulation a little bit behind, you go, I'm not sure where this is going to go. It's incredibly dangerous to hold you up as a sort of poster child and say they've done a great, because everybody will gravitate around that thing. And what you want, in theory, as a regulator, is for firms to be thinking for themselves. So you don't want them lazily copying, because what works for you might not work for a different organization. So that's one of the reasons they do it. The second thing is to avoid embarrassment. So imagine, if they give you a sort of gold star equivalent, they don't want to shout about it too much, because then that's hostage to fortune, right? What happens if later on you have another issue? This poster child that's there. And so it's much easier for them to focus on the negative side. Now, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a tendency amongst regulators to sort of step back a bit and go, "We're not going to tell you how to run your business. You should know what the right thing to do is." And there's some sense to that, in that the people who do know how to run the business best probably are sitting within there. You don't want kind of backseat drivers from the regulator. But I think sometimes they just lay it open, and you could frame that as entrapment, because you'd sort of go, well, we don't want to give them too much guidance because we don't know what might happen. We'll protect our position to be able to prosecute or investigate things. And so if we haven't provided too much clarity, it means the onus is all on the firms. So from a political perspective, when things go wrong somewhere in the industry, you haven't put something out there that could potentially be a hostage of fortune. So that's the sort of political logic. But I agree with you. I think it's incredibly unhelpful. I mean, there are some things you can't, like ethics, for example, really hard to codify, really hard to set guidance. So I've got some sympathy where they don't get too prescriptive. And of course, remember, when you have prescriptive, this applies to compliance as well. If you have overly prescriptive rules, and we could include guidance in that, you actually create loopholes, because the fatter the rule book, it feels safer. We've covered everything. But if there's something you haven't put in there, by implication, it's permitted. Because you've written a really fat rule book, you would have put it in there if you meant to say that. So actually, fat rule books can create loopholes, and maybe, just maybe, guidance or poster children can create a similar issue, which is you'd say, well, actually, we just followed it. We followed. You said this was best practice. We followed these people, and so you give people an excuse, you give them an out, and it stops people having to think for themselves. So I think there's a really interesting balancing act here. But I agree with you. On balance, there is much more of a tendency to go, we're not here to tell you what to do, but you kind of are, right?
Yeah.
Because you'll hammer us if we get it wrong, but you're not going to tell us what getting it wrong means. I think there's room to sort of shift a little bit away from where we are at the moment.
Yeah, I've got just one more thing, because we see it in day to day in our own work, that when somebody, let's say within an anti-financial crime team or within the data protection team, when they do something good and we shout about it across the business, that behavior is repeated. Whereas when somebody does something bad and we say, look, let's say, for example, you're going to get a warning for this, that hasn't stopped it from happening again. People just don't tell us about it when it does happen.
Yeah.
So is there a way that we can learn from that, or are we doing the right thing by shouting about the good stuff and not shouting about the bad stuff? Or is there an approach to that you think works best?
Yeah, I mean, if the narrative is constantly, here's all the things that have gone wrong, one, you make it sound like it's much worse. So let's take a social media example, right? So there's all these stories that you can see, pick your platform of choice. You'll find stories telling you about how dangerous London is. Well, there's all these videos there.
Yeah.
And so that perception, for many people, there's lots of people that have never been to the UK, right, who think it's a sort of crime-ridden hellhole. And that's not to say that it's perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but that's the impression that people get. And so you can imagine that same sort of echo chamber, I only get one perspective. If all that comes out of the compliance function or regulators is, here's all the bad things that have happened, sort of deterrence type narrative, we've caught all these awful people, then you're not seeing the opposite side of it. So I think it is helpful to have situations where we talk about the good things that have happened. Maybe we should be talking about business that we've turned down. That stuff that we've done, not stuff that was illegal, right? But stuff that we had a choice. We made a business rationale not to do that particular thing because we didn't think it was right for us. So I think spreading good news is absolutely helpful. And we have to balance that with the deterrent side of it. And I think one of the big mistakes that compliance functions often make is a classic example. Here's a load of people that haven't done something we need them to do, an attestation, or they haven't done some training or something. So what we do is we email all those people to say, you're very naughty, you haven't done this training. And if you're not careful here and you use either the to field or the CC, suddenly you make everybody on that list aware of all the other people that haven't done it. And if there's a senior person on that list, you've suddenly highlighted the fact they haven't done it and kind of given permission to everybody else. What you can't see with that little email is the millions or thousands of people that have done it. You're just seeing the people that haven't. And so we have to be careful around normalizing non-compliance by talking too much about non-compliance. So I think sometimes we ignore, again, back to the nothing happens here is a good outcome. Maybe we have to find things to talk about, because otherwise the only narrative is here's when someone screwed up. And the more of those you have, the more you go, well, this seems like an organization where everything goes wrong. Terrible, right?
I almost done that exact thing.
Yeah.
I could see you smiling, because I almost done that exact thing the other day, where a load of members of the compliance team hadn't done a business-wide training course, and I was so agitated by it, because I was like, we're the compliance department. We're the ones that get annoyed when other people don't do our training, and yet we're not doing this, say, data protection training. So I sent not an email, and I didn't highlight who it was, but I sent an email to the whole team saying this needs to be done by the end of the week. And it's funny that you said that, because now I'm thinking maybe I should have gone either to the individuals or gone well done to the guys that have finished it
Right.
and done a different approach. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really interesting campaign in Amsterdam. So I'm a big fan of what I call compliance in the wild, right? Let's have a look at, step outside the confines of compliance. Let's look in the big wide world and say, what can we learn from what's going on? And so my other half hates this, because I just stop and take pictures of signs or just weird stuff I see on the street. And she's like, what are you doing? And she's given up now, because she just goes, it's him doing his weird thing. And sometimes I don't know why I'm taking the pictures. There's just something that's kind of triggered my curiosity. And 6 months later, I'll work out what it is, or maybe never. But I'm always looking at kind of public campaigns for things. So government, so COVID was great for this, right? The world's largest, everybody knows what compliance is, right? We discovered during COVID, and we also discovered the bits of compliance that none of us like, right? Being told what to. So I'm always on the lookout for these things. So Amsterdam had this campaign for targeted, let's be honest, mainly at British tourists going over there for all the reasons that people might go over to Amsterdam. So there's this whole campaign. There's a website you can go I think it's howtoamsterdam.com. And so they ran this website telling you all about the things you weren't allowed to do. And then on the streets, they've got various signs about saying, for example, buying drugs on the street is illegal, right? So those sorts of warnings. And those signs they're very logical, right? You're warning people, but you're also telling them the reason you've put the sign up there is clearly this is a location where lots of people buy and sell drugs, right? Otherwise and so often when we're talking about things we don't want to have happen, we put ideas into people's heads where you sort of go, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I kind of know I'm in the right place. Or in the case of your emails, I know I'm in good company. When we run poster campaigns or we shout about things, clearly we would only be shouting if it were a problem. So we just need to be slightly careful that each time we think we're doing something good, we're actually, this is where the behavioral science bit's interesting, right? Is we find out the subtle signaling is actually, this is going on a lot, hence they've made the effort to communicate it. So I think your idea of how do we communicate the positives works really, really well. Top tip for anybody watching or listening is make sure if you ever use percentages, so like 80% of you, that's fine. The closer you can get to 100% to describe the outcome you're looking for. If you send something around that says 40% of you have done this, that also communicates that 60% haven't. And it's a really subtle cue, but those are the sorts of things that we pick up. So I think that's why I think it's just interesting. Just before we do things, just stop and go, is there a potential downside to this? And so it always strikes me that when we look at, say medicine, right, on the side of a packet of pills, it will have what we call in medical terms side effects. Now, side effects is a nonsense term, right? Side effects is just the stuff that happens that we didn't want to have happen. Yeah. But a side effect is just an effect. Every single thing we do in compliance, and ditto for regulators, there will be some unintended consequences. They might be minor, but we should acknowledge what those are. And so I think that's a lovely example. You're setting out there going, here's an objective. I need them to do this training for all the reasons you outlined. It's really important. Now, it might be interesting feedback as to why they're not doing it, right? There might be there's a really interesting thing there. If loads of people aren't doing the training, why is that the case, right? If we sent it at a bad time, is the training terrible? No, you're not in charge of that training, but it's a useful exercise for you to think about why your team aren't bothering to do it. But if you want to get people to do it, so the outcome I need them to have done this by this particular thing. What tools could I use? And there isn't going to be a perfect tool that doesn't somehow signal things you don't mean to signal. You might irritate them on some level. It might mean something else gets deprioritized. But think about those downsides, those unintended consequences, and then try and identify the thing that is most likely to get the outcome you're looking for. I would suggest that highlighting that loads of people haven't done it probably doesn't help you in the way that one might think. But that's the gut reaction, right? That's the traditional toolkit. I totally understand why you've done it. And particularly in the heat of the moment, you're going, I need to get this thing done. But there will be, what in medical terms, are side effects. So one of the other things I say to people is, if we think about that logic, if you're going to introduce a policy, a rule, or a control, you don't want to disclose this to the people that are going to be subject to it, but you might be thinking to yourself, okay, where might this go wrong? And if I've got an inkling that this could have an unintended consequence, knowing what that is in advance means you can monitor against it. And you can sort of go, oh, actually, that looks like didn't work the way we intended. Let's shift away from that. But if you're not aware of that in the first place, you will assume you've nailed it.
We had that discussion, I think it was a few weeks ago, where you were organising either anti-money laundering or fraud training. And I'd said to you, does everybody need to do this training? Because in terms of side effects, there's a risk right there. You train somebody who this isn't relevant to, and all of a sudden now they know about fraud.
Yeah.
Beforehand they didn't know what fraud was or how to commit it, and now
they're experts.
Yeah, now telling them the techniques to look out for, they know how to commit it. So that's a good point.
Yeah.
Like with the side effects of training, I don't think compliance professionals always think about when they're delivering training or releasing a policy. And I've been victim to this in the past. I'm like, right, the whole business needs to know about this, and it's only when you learn from a mistake that you're like, actually, maybe not everybody needs to know all the money laundering techniques that are out there.
Thank you guys again for joining us for another episode of the Compliance Chronicles. We continue to say Thank you, and we want you to continue to watch, like, comment, subscribe, turn notification bells on, and hype the episode if you like it. Thank you.
Well, I always think it's fascinating, right? Is there will be some people who need to understand the mechanics of money laundering, so that because they're in a role where they can help prevent it. There's a load of other people who probably don't need to know that at all, but maybe they need to just understand the concept and be aware that this is an impact on the business. You could look at travel policies. You go, there will be people who travel for business that need to understand this stuff. But people who are unlikely to travel don't need to. All they need to know is that there is such a thing as a travel policy. So if they ever found themselves in an unusual position of traveling, that I better go and check what the policy says. Or even better, you build it into the travel process, right? So if you're booking travel, you've never booked travel before, magically you go through a training program at that point in time where it feels relevant to you. And I think this whole "we make everybody do it" thing, I blame regulators for this as well, right? Because it's the best narrative ever. You just say to the we have made everybody do the training. Right, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Except your point is, what happens when people get training that's irrelevant to them? Well, if it feels like it's irrelevant, they're probably not paying attention. You've irritated the hell out of them because they're doing something that's utterly pointless, and you've wasted cognitive capacity on things that they don't need to know. So that's kind of negligent, right? That's sort of, imagine you had a robot in a factory and you went, I'm going to get this robot to do some things that don't help the business in any way, shape or form. People go, why are you wasting time with that? Or let's use a server for a particular activity that's pointless. You get in trouble for that, but yet we're allowed to sort of waste people's time and go just in the name of being able to say everything. But you send a signal to people that you don't care. Well, I think your time is completely worthless because I'm going to waste a load of it doing training that's pointless. And what that means is, one, you're wasting their time, but two, when there's stuff that is important, they're just going to go, it's those idiots again, right? More ridiculous training from the people that brought you this other crap. Have some more of this stuff. And so I would say the worst bit of training, the most irrelevant bit of training, the most boring bit of training becomes the poster child for your entire function. And so I don't think we should inject a sort of little bit of a customer satisfaction lens on this thing and go, what's this experience? Does the employee know why this is relevant? And if the employee doesn't understand why it's relevant, then you're probably not going to land anyway. But what signals are we sending by doing this? So I agree, yeah, but and I understand completely. And typically what happens is somebody commits to a regulator somewhere or to the board, we're going to make everybody do this training, without thinking about, well, might that have unintended consequences? And the answer is, yeah. We've all sat through training courses where you've just gone, I don't understand this.
Yeah.
The kind of like, when you join an office, it's sort of like, we'll teach you how to lift boxes safely or move furniture, right? Those sorts of things where you sort of go, it's either patronizingly simple, right, or I'm never going to do this, or even I'm not going to retain any of this, right? I'm just not interested. If I need to do something in the office, I'm not going to, I must remember back to the training course about how to pick a box up. Right. Yet we force everybody to go through that because it's convenient. You can say you force everybody to go through it. I think that's negligent, and I think that's the bit we need to get away from.
Yeah, it's like watching a bad movie.
Yeah.
Someone says, now you've got to sit through 2 hours of the sequel.
Yeah, we had of course, not too long ago where we had to do something similar. But then I'm really intrigued to find out when that light bulb moment was for you, because as a former employee of the regulator, if we look at take like the financial crisis, for example, 2008, following that, there was approximately 22,000 new pages of regulatory rules created as a consequence. But then, as somebody who's worked in regulation and also in some banks, some big banks in operations, what was the light bulb moment for you to go, actually, no, we don't need these more of these pages. We need better pages. When was that? What happened? Take us through
So
that.
I had a really, really unusual set of circumstances, and I think I would have got to this point anyway. But there was a real light bulb moment, which was me eating my own regulatory cooking. So let's just rewind. So I would never have gone to work in compliance, right? It was never my vocation. It was never anything that excited me. And whisper, I don't think anybody's, no one as a kid goes, yeah, when I grow up, I'm going to be a compliance officer. And you know what happens? Do you know what happens? People object to that. People go, but that's not true because my daughter's really excited about it. Yeah, because you've indoctrinated them, right? You've brought it. But most people don't grow up wanting to be a compliance officer. And so I didn't. And so I ended up with this sort of strange accident. I became an accidental regulator because in 2011, they were shaking up the UK regulatory system, breaking up the FSA, the single regulator. And they were looking for people that were not natural regulators. And a headhunter called me, and I'd done various roles in banking with a little bit of kind of regulatory stuff, but not huge amount, and said, how do you fancy working at the Bank of England? And I was like, yeah, sounds interesting. And so I kind of went for the interview process thinking they're not going to give this to me, but let's just see what happens. Anyway, Fast forward to the thing where there was something in what I had to say and my approach, and I was always very honest. I was like, I wouldn't hire me. I know nothing about banking regulation, so don't hire me on that basis. But if you want somebody who recognises potentially where the compliance experience hasn't been that fun, or we just want a fresh approach, then maybe I'm the person. Anyway, for some reason they decided to hire me. And I spent most of my time as a regulator. I was in supervision, so the bit of regulation that faces off against the firms, covering one firm, which was UBS. In fact, 7 days after I joined, heading up an international banking supervision team, there was a rogue trader at UBS in London. So I spent a lot of time focusing on this one firm. And then they break the regulator up. I go to the Bank of England, I become COO at the regulator. Don't want to be a central banker, so I'm like, where can I go? And the UK is one of the places where you're allowed to move between regulator and regulatee. Some jurisdictions ban that. And so I went to UBS and I worked in risk and compliance for the one business in the firm that hadn't really had any issues, which was asset management. And I had this incredible experience of implementing stuff, by which I mean I would own policies. I would get, I love it, invitations to mandatory training. Just reflect on that for a second. It's an oxymoron. It's either invitation or it's mandatory. It can't be both. From myself. So the machine would, as head of compliance, right? The machine would spit this stuff out. So I'd be receiving emails from myself inviting me to go and do this training. And I was just like, this sucks. I don't understand why this is pointless. And I knew where a lot of it had come from. And a lot of it had come from, here's a problem in wealth management or the investment bank. We're going to impose it across the firm. And you would end up with things, sometimes it was just boring or irrelevant. It was actually, there were times where a rule that made perfect sense in one context actually was causing problems in another. And so as I was going through this thing, I suddenly just went, I've got to deal with this, right? Because I'm owning this problem and I know where it's come from. And it's come with good intent, but it's landed on, and some of that was back to Alex's point, is that let's make everybody in the firm do this thing, even if it's not relevant to their business. And so having had that experience, I was just like, we're going to solve this problem. And what I realized was that compliance is all about humans. Right? You can say to a website or a legal entity or a building, be compliant, but it's not going to respond. It's the humans in the organization that will determine whether or not you're compliant. So that was the first bit. I was like, oh, we're in the business of influencing people. And if you start to look at it through a behavioral science lens, you just go, this is madness. We do stuff you wouldn't do in any other context. And then the second bit was the risk profile of my job. So operational risk was the second part of my job, so non-financial risk. That was always about people. Right? Whenever something went wrong, there was a human component involved causing the problem or making it worse by the way they reacted or didn't. So suddenly I just went, my whole job is about influencing people. And the moment you start to look at it through that lens of, does this make sense? You suddenly realize there's a ton of effort and money being wasted on this stuff. And I was like, I can't stand for this. So I sort of went on, the mission began there.
Has that changed at all over the last, say, year or two, that human risk part with the evolution of AI? Are you still of the mindset that humans, that's where the risk is? Or now, because there is such a reliance in compliance teams on some AI tools, that's shifting slightly?
No, I think it's more important than ever before. And I'll tell you why. Yes, I'm talking my own book. Let's be clear about that as well. Right. So let's start with AI. What is it? Well, it is processing human data. Now we're going to have this sort of AI eats itself, channeling its own data. But bottom line is, we're taking human data, we're using it, and some human somewhere is deciding where to deploy the AI. And so as you look at that, the whole that's fueled by human experience and human decision making as to where to deploy it. So that's dynamic one, what's relevant. I think the second bit is, if you look at what are people going to be doing as the AI takes over more and more roles? And the answer is stuff that only humans can do, right? Because if you can give it to tech, you can give it to technology. So what does that involve? Well, that's things like nuance, judgment, emotional intelligence, the human connection, all those sorts of things. Creativity, probably. That is where we are at our absolute best, right? That's why it's worth hiring people. On the other hand, that's when we pose the largest amount of risk. So if you think about the sort of judgment calls that we're expecting, we'll put a human in charge of this because we couldn't have a machine doing it because that would feel wrong, or we don't think the machines or we can't codify it. Well, then you're relying massively on human judgment. At which point I go, this risk is even greater, right? Because people are going to be spending more and more time doing things that only humans can do. And therefore, more and more of their time is when they are at their best, but also potentially at their worst. So my argument is, actually, this is going to get more significant and more important as we go on. But I fully recognize I'm biased in this regard because it suits my argument. But I think that kind of has to be true, that we're asking people to be more human than ever before.
No, I agree completely. We've been having this discussion with either previous guests or within firms that we work with, that they have this well, we've built this tool that will onboard our customers for us. So, the amount of issues that we're having with human error has decreased. And the point that we make is very similar to yours, that it might be less frequent, but the severity of the human risk is probably that much higher because they make a mistake, which your whole AI tool is built on, that could cause
Yeah.
monumental
Right.
Yeah,
issues.
fundamentally, the flaw is there. And on top of that, I guess in the spirit of artificial intelligence, learning language models, is to empower humans to make the higher level decisions or more important decisions. And if they're making high level decisions and more important decisions, then again the risk is exponentially increased on there. So going back again, so funny enough, we were talking about nobody actually wanted to work in compliance. I think that was literally one of the first things we discussed when we started this, and one of the reasons why we started this. I actually had a discussion with a cousin of mine at a dinner on Sunday over a 40th birthday party. And actually, she said, I'm actually interested in getting involved in compliance now. She actually works in childcare. She goes, I've been watching some of the episodes and I think compliance is super simple. And I laughed and I laughed at her. I said, look, compliance is simple in theory, but very, very complex at times in application. So what I want to discuss with you is just that complexity problem. So from your perspective, from the behavioral side, how do we address this complexity piece from regulation all the way down to application within organizations?
So I love the fact that you're out there selling this career, right? And there will be people in the future.
I didn't sell it actually. She was randomly had the. She's like, I'll be in
But the podcast is serving that purpose, right?
Yeah.
Is you're demystifying it a little bit.
Yeah.
So what I love is this is serving two purposes. On the one hand, it's designed to help compliance professionals think about what they're doing and to get different insights they couldn't get elsewhere. On the other hand, it is a little bit of a marketing job for compliance, right? Is you're sort of go, this is a bit more interesting than you think. So I love that. So yeah, on the complexity front, I think look, life is complicated, right, and difficult and challenging, and we love to pretend it's nice and simple. And if you look, you go on social media, you see all these hacks, right? Life hack for this, life hack. Now some of them are helpful, but a lot of the time it's just it's sort of overly simplified. Simple solutions for complex problems would be the sort of logic. So I'd look at compliance and I sort of say there is a temptation there to sort of say, well, let's just make everything super simple. Let's pretend everything is black and white. So we do this with training, right? We pretend everything's black and white. And so you get a sort of, you get very simplified case studies. So my favorite one in banking was always, you're sitting in a meeting and your client's sister comes in with a suitcase full of gold bullion or money or whatever, right? Right. And then what do you do? And I kind of think, why are we picking a case study like that, which is very unlikely to happen? And if it does happen, people would go, this is a bit weird. I'm going to get some help, right? That's not a normal situation. And if people think that is a normal situation, you've got bigger problems, then they need a heck of a lot more training than that, right? So we do this because I think it's nice to take these complex issues. Let's make it simple. Let's have a very clear case study where there's a right and a wrong answer, and then we can mark. We can do exam at the end of it, right? We can mark people out of 10, and then they've paid attention, they have understood, but they don't need help with that stuff, particularly if you're allegedly hiring smart people. Right, they need help with the grey areas, the stuff that's complex, the stuff that's not obvious, the things that you might think you do it this way, but actually there's a law that you're probably not aware of that you need to do it that way. Or your natural tendency might be to do X. We need to curb that. We need to help you make better decisions. And how you manage that then is to sit back and say, well, let's think about things from the perspective of the employees. And one of the things this is where behavioral science is super helpful. One of the things that we suffer from as compliance professionals is something called the curse of knowledge. And that's the idea that if you're an expert in something, it's really difficult to put yourself in a position of someone that isn't. You're cursed by the knowledge because you can't unknow stuff. And so things that can feel super, like, oh, it's bloody obvious why we have this particular rule, won't be to them. And whisper it, we know that the average employee isn't interested in compliance, right? By which I don't mean they want to break the rules. By which I mean, if they were passionate about reading rules and thinking this stuff, they'd be working with you in compliance. They're interested in sales, whatever their day job is. And so we have to put ourselves in the position of somebody that isn't interested in this subject that we, in theory, have some kind of interest or affinity towards. And so recognizing that the things that we think are important might not be obvious to them, and the stuff that they have problems with might not be obvious to us. And so we have to put ourselves into their shoes and really think about how do we manage that. So the complexity piece, I think complexity comes from the depth of regulation, the breadth of it, when it might kick in. There's a whole load of stuff that can be. Our job in compliance is to translate all that complexity into simple, actionable things for people to help them make better decisions. Now, sometimes you're going to need to give them a ton of technical detail. Well, back to the money laundering example, right? There will be people for whom the mechanics of money are really, really important because they're in a position where They might be able to observe it firsthand, or they may be part of the process. So they need to understand the detail. Everybody else just needs to have a broad understanding of it. And so how we train people, how we communicate, how we give them information will depend on what level of detail they need. So rather than doing a one-size-fits-all of information dump on everybody, is we need to meet people where they not where we'd like them to be, but where they actually are. Meet them actually, and say what does this person in this particular role need, and recognize that that's going to be different for different people. So I think the job of compliance is almost to deal with that complexity and go not necessarily dumb it down, although sometimes we will have to dumb stuff down. But there's stuff that we need to know that they don't need to know. The objective isn't to turn every single employee into a mini compliance officer. And yet some of the training, it's exactly what we do, right? So we do things like we teach people, failure to comply with this law could see you go to jail for 5, 10 or 15 years, right?
That's training.
Right. So we do that because we can then test whether they've been paying attention. Right, we're testing their short-term memory. Right? Can they retain some numbers for very short? That doesn't tell you anything about whether they've understood the basic subject, but it's easy to test. So we test. But if you think about it, you sort of go, why are we teaching them that? They need to know it's serious, but they don't need to, because I don't want someone going, rule A, that's a 5 years in jail, whereas rule C is 50. I'll break rule A. Look, it's an irrelevancy. We shouldn't be thinking about how many years we might go to jail because we shouldn't be doing the thing in the first place. And yet we teach people about the genesis of regulations. Now, that might be relevant if the real rule doesn't make any sense, but generally, they don't need to know the 20 iterations of the rule and how we've got to here and back in 1664, such as. Now, it might be useful for making it interesting if there's a fun story to tell, but generally speaking, it's not. And, we badge training by the name of the regulation. Why do we do that? Like nobody's sitting there going, yay, I've been invited on some, and actually, a lot of the words is prevention, right? Anti this. Okay, so we know if we're going on a prevention course, it's going to force us to do something different than what we would otherwise do. That's more work for me. Why don't we try and group things in an interesting way? Travel is my favorite example. There'll be loads of policies that kick in for people that are traveling. So let's make sure that we group those together, because that's a human experience. Right? I am traveling to another country equals something I can relate to. Pick your regulations, right? But the name of the regulations are I don't care. I'm not interested in that stuff. And so we batch it in the wrong way, I think, sometimes as well. And we do things on a cadence that suits us. So like anytime there's an annual process, it is for the convenience of the people administering the process. Right. So we'll have an annual attestation, or we'll have an annual training thing, annual whatever. Risk doesn't present itself on an annual basis, right? It presents as it comes. And so I think, if we could think about the cadence we do things, the timing, sending something, and this matters hugely, right? Sending an email out on a Friday afternoon, making inquiries of people, is not the same as sending it on let's not pick a Monday morning, but Tuesday morning, right? Different vibe. Don't send people bulky compliance training just before they go off on Christmas. Yeah. Right? Don't train people about gifts and entertainment at a point in the year when there's less likelihood. Do that at the point in the year when it's most relevant. And so I think all of these things is around, back to the original question, I've obviously massively complicated the issue, but what we're trying to do here is to say, how do we, taking the complexity, and the job of compliance, I think, is take all that complexity, bring it together in a way that makes sense to people, that allows them to do their job compliantly, not to try and turn them into mini compliance officers.
And I agree 100%. I think one saying I heard recently was effective compliance and regulation is simplifying a complex world. And that goes pretty much with what you said. So then how does that look like in application? When we talk about the important elements of behavioral science, like you're saying, trust, so creating social norms, making things easier, what does that look like for a regulator? If there's advice you give to a regulator, what does it look like for an organization then, those specific things from a behavioral science perspective that can be applied in a business?
So the really important thing is, if we're trying to influence people to do something or not do something, we've got to recognize what are we trying to do here? And sometimes it's going to be under no circumstances do this, right? So this is a very, very hard thing that we mustn't do. Other times it's going to be a qualitative component. So if I think about doing the right thing, well, that can mean a multitude of things. It's very hard to codify. So we have to work out, what is it that we're trying to get to? What's the behavior that we're trying to drive? And how much of that do we need people's judgment to be involved in? So when we're talking earlier about airlines, if we think about the physical world, it's very, very easy to codify things in the physical world because that's predictable. So if we look at first aid training, for example, we teach people technical, and it's always just do exactly the same thing each time, because whatever human you come across, this will be applicable. Think about something like ethics is much more complicated. So the answer simply is work out what are the behaviors that we're trying to drive. In other words, the decision making that we want people to make. And is that qualitative? Is that absolute? Is it always going to be the same? Do we need to use their judgment? And then say, what are the best tools that we have to make that happen? Now, often what we're doing is we've got to think about how to close gaps, right? So if they are already doing the thing that we need them to do, there's no point. We don't need to train people. I always joke about things like murder is bad training. Nobody needs to be told that, right? So if you're going to deal with that particular subject, have a nuance on it that makes it intelligible. If you are hiring a load of people from outside your industry, where something might not be obvious to them, banking, for example, all of your calls and emails will be monitored. Right? That might not be obvious to people. That might be a helpful thing to point out to them. You're closing a knowledge gap that they might not have. So we might be closing a knowledge gap. We might be making them aware of something that they have never thought about. We might be dealing with a common error. So we know that when this sort of situation arises, people have a tendency to do X. And so working out how do we close that particular gap, and sometimes it's going to be communicating, sometimes it's training, sometimes we need to use, whisper, we need to use threats. You will be punished if you don't do these things. It's that toolkit of combination of things. And I think often we have the tools. We don't think broadly enough about what those tools might be. But we might deploy the wrong tools on it. So the question is, what objective are we trying to get? So what is it they're not doing that we need them to do? Or what is it they're doing we don't want them to do? How do we shift that particular thing? And when you look at the problems that way, suddenly a load of the things that we do in compliance, you go, well, that's not a very good way of solving that problem. And so that's the basic philosophy. Underpinning that is, well, what are these different toolkits? Well, there's tons of different frameworks that you can use that are the range from the very, very simple to the incredibly complicated, that tell you about some of the dynamics. So social is a really good, so social proof, right? We put very simply, we copy what other people, or either what we see or we think other people are doing. So if we're back to the crime rates in London, we have a perception based on these videos that we've seen from people. If we're taught in a training course that this is an ethical organization, induction training classic, we are a very ethical organization. Why are they saying that? Right? Is it because they're not ethical? And then we go out and we observe for real. If there's a disconnect between those two things, we will go with what we observe other people do. And so so social is a good example of a tool where you could say, is there a social influence on this that is way more powerful than what we are doing in our training? And so maybe we want to, back to the emails, that's a really good example of using social. If lots of people are doing the thing we want, then maybe we can highlight that fact. If virtually no one is doing this stuff, don't talk about it.
Yeah.
So that would be bringing the social thing to it. So what you can use is a range of different things that all point towards things that influence human decision making, and then play with those and dial them up or down. And the beauty of behavioral science is it's not slavishly following. There are going to be situations in which you don't have there's certain levers you can't pull, right? Either because it's against the law, or because you don't have the money, or because there's another prevalent narrative that's even more powerful. So it's a case of identifying what can you do within these bounds. And so there are a number of behavioral science frameworks out there that will allow people to identify what levers might be relevant here. And that's why I come back to my whole compliance in the wild thing, is often the problems we're trying to solve in compliance, somebody has tried to solve in a different context. Now, they might have solved it appallingly, right? Might have done something terrible that you'd never want to copy, or they might have done a brilliant job. And so the idea that human influencing is just a compliance thing, marketing does it the whole time. Let's borrow from those particular things.
Yeah.
Do you think, based on that, like the examples you've given there, do you think sometimes leaders, not just compliance leaders, but leaders in businesses, underestimate how much their behavior shapes risk culture and employee behavior? Do you think they underestimate that? Like CEOs, founders?
Well, it's really funny, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you sort of, when you get to a senior position, I'm very important, and they know, for example, that they need to make a speech at, say, a town hall, or they want their face at the front of the annual report. They will have to sign off on big decisions, and big announcements. The company will come from them. So on the one hand, they know the influence they have. On the other hand, I think it's the subtle cues that they sometimes don't think about. We've all been to these training. Let's do some compliance training. Let's get a senior person to introduce the training, right? To say this is very important. And so that they'll do. And I've seen terrible ones where you end up, somebody turns up and goes, so welcome to this. What does this say? What's this training? This is what? Anyway, very, very important training. Good luck with it. I'm off to do something else, but this is really important training, right? And then they either sit at the front and play on their phone, or they don't pay attention. They walk out the door, and you kind of go, you've just made it worse. right? You have absolutely made it worse. And so I think sometimes they don't realize, maybe they don't care in some cases, the impact that they have. And it's not those formal things, it's those informal things. And, saying things that are patently not true. So we sort of get, the sort of public pronouncements about things where you sort of go, that doesn't ring true, will have a massive deleterious effect on compliance programs. So I mean, I struggle. It obviously depends on individual circumstances. I struggle to say whether they, do they not care? Do they not understand it? I think recognizing that you probably have more influence than you think, and actually, it's those uncomfortable little things where it might be more convenient for you to bend a rule. It might be more convenient for you to turn a blind eye to something. That has a massive. So here's your star salesperson who's doing really, really, really well. Yeah, we know they're a bit fast and loose, a bit handsy or whatever we might have called it in the old days, right? We'll let them off though. Those sorts of things are massively significant. And so I think the job of being a leader is actually a damn sight harder because they have to recognise this stuff. In a way, they're being watched the whole time. And so we talk about having one rule for everybody. I think, unfortunately, for leaders, they've got to be exemplary with all this stuff. So I think it's kind of, there are things that they're human as well, right? So they will make mistakes, but I think some of them conveniently ignore it because it's difficult.
Yeah.
Just conscious of the time now. So I've got a survey from the Organization for Economics Cooperation and Development, and that was surveying 28 countries. And from the survey for success in 2025, 61% cited compliance obligations as the company's biggest challenge to date. What is the one thing from a behavioral science perspective, if you could give it today, that would move the needle on driving that percentage down from 61%?
So I'm giggling about that because I don't know what that means, right? Does that mean we understand the rules fully, but we struggle to get our people to follow them, or we don't understand the rules, or is it just a general? In that kind of survey, it could just mean rules suck, right? They stop us from doing the things that we. So who knows what that particular thing?
I can go on to next step, which might give clarity. So then, only 17% of countries stated that the regulation was easy to understand. So
okay,
probably a combination of this lack of ease and
right. So let's remember, it is always in people's interest to pretend that rules are difficult, challenging, and complicated. Right. So one of the things that as regulators and compliance officers we need to do is to make sure remove those excuses. Right. So if you present something as highly complicated, highly challenging, highly difficult that only compliance can handle, don't be surprised when people go, well, that sounded a bit difficult. I've decided not to touch that. So I think the key bit is to recognize, it comes back to that translation piece, right? Taking things that are complicated and challenging and translate. The reason we have a compliance function is that, one, we need some independence, right? So people to review what's going on. But the second thing is because we don't operate in a world where we could just send every employee the regulatory update. Here's those things you get from law firms or whatever, right? You wouldn't send those direct to employees. Go read this, you'll be fine, right? We need people to translate it. So I think one of the things that regulators do is they dump things on firms in the expectation that somebody's going to. Now, I think regulators should make their rules simpler and clearer, but I think the job of compliance is to remove that level of complexity. So I would say let's take people at face value. Let's take those comments at face value. I would say regulators need to make their rules simpler and clearer. But if you have a compliance function, it is their job to understand it and do that translation service. So maybe that's the failure of the compliance functions within those organizations for not doing that translation service well enough.
Thank you. Yeah. Alex has a saying which he uses nearly every episode, which is compliance regulation is based on yesterday's failings. Should it then be, based on your perspective, that compliance or regulation should be based on behaviors or designed around behaviors rather than failings?
So we need to learn from things that have gone wrong, right? Really, really, really important. And that's why we have investigations, and we should react to that, recognizing where the rules haven't matched. But I would rather be in a world where we stop bad things from happening in the first place. So if we were doing this conversation in the US, I'd have lots of people saying to me things like, what do prosecutors think about this? Very sort of like, when we get into trouble, how do we minimize the trouble that we're in? I think we cannot get ourselves into trouble in the first place by being more intelligent about it. So yes, there's a learning from the past, but there's also a preventative element which says, let's make sure, to the extent that we can, let's recognize how humans actually behave, not how we'd like them to behave, but how they're likely to behave. And let's design systems and processes that make it more likely we'll get the outcomes we're looking for. So yes, we learn from the past, but I think we need to be much more in sort of stopping bad things from happening zone, rather than kind of like, how do we look good when this goes wrong?
Yeah, we have that discussion all the time because it's funny because when things go wrong in a business, then compliance typically implements a new policy, a new procedure,
and gets massive budget.
Yeah,
right. That's the way.
Yeah, and then the same thing for regulators. I don't know many regulators that are thinking what's going to be an issue next year or the year after. It's usually we've just done an assessment. This has gone wrong. Let's launch a new publication to tell everybody don't do this again. So they're very reactive as opposed to proactive with any regulation. And businesses, unfortunately, compliance departments are usually the same. We're not normally thinking about what might be a problem in a week's time, a year's time. It's usually we'll roll this out, see how it sits, and then react to it.
Yeah, and I'm doing a session this afternoon with a bank actually, where they're talking about compliance as a proactive risk management function.
Nice.
In other words, sure, we've got the regulations are there, we need to comply with them, but how do we think ahead? Where might things go wrong that we haven't yet predicted? And therefore, the reason you have humans in that compliance function is to start thinking those things through. And so it becomes a much more forward-looking piece. So closer to risk than it is just following rules.
Yeah, I think that's what we'll discuss. I'm conscious of the time in the future episode is around that new compliance leader. And what does that look like in terms of more strategic, rather than being able to really recite and follow policies or rules that are being set. So, Alex, any final questions? I know you usually have a final question for our guests.
I'll ask just one.
Okay.
So we end on a positive. So normally I ask a couple of questions, but the one question I'll always ask, which is not relevant to compliance, just in general, is for our listeners and viewers to take something away positive. Tell us about a recent success that you've had. It can be personal or work related, something that's gone well and that you're proud of.
So I'm constantly experimenting, right? Because because if you work for yourself, you have no excuse for not trying things out, right? Because there's the constraints on me. So I'm constantly trying things. So we were talking about this before recording. Well, I'll talk about this here as well. So I was invited to do a keynote presentation at a conference, and then they said to me, "Would you do it over dinner?" And I thought, well, we need to match it to this. So 3-course dinner equals 3-course keynote. And I hadn't really thought about, actually, that's quite a stressful environment to be in because you're competing with food and general conversation. And it went really, really, really well. And so I've now signed up to do stand-up comedy to see if we can turn compliance into the subject of a stand-up comedy routine. I am absolutely terrified. But my view is if you don't spend life doing things that terrify you every so, there's certain things you shouldn't do that terrify you. But generally speaking, if we don't stretch our comfort zones, not going well. So this year for me is a year of just trying stuff out. So that's the first step. And if that stand-up comedy goes well, who knows where it might take us?
I love that. Yeah, that's a really good one.
If you manage to make compliance funny, then you've done an absolutely amazing job.
Well, we'll learn something, right? So if it goes horribly wrong, we'll discover it's not funny.
Yeah.
I think it is quite funny. So that's the punt. But look, we're going to try it to find out.
No,
Yeah.
Thank you so
I find compliance in the wild hilarious. Like I find some of the anecdotes there, like little things like there's a walkway that seems very simple to use, but then there's a pathway, but people keep taking the worn route around because the government or the council decided to put a fence up
Yeah.
because they didn't want people walking through a certain route, and it's had the opposite effect. Now all the grass is worn down
Yeah.
because you haven't thought about what actually the people want to do.
yeah,
What's the
behaviours.
easiest? I think you said something. Well, what's the easiest path to compliance or something like that? It's a
Path
Path
of
of
least
least
resistance.
Path of-
Right,
yeah.
Path of least
Can't get my
resistance,
words out.
Yeah. So it's funny. So on the one hand, I'm preaching path of least resistance for compliance people. On the other hand, I'm setting myself the path of most resistance, the most challenge. So there we go.
I think it's going to go really well.
Amazing.
I think we'll be there to witness.
No, we will be.
To heckle, hopefully.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what
At the front of the crowd.
Yeah.
Right. And it's over dinner, so you'll be able to throw bread rolls
Oh,
at me or
amazing.
whatever else.
Perfect. Well, this has been amazing. The time's flown by. So thank you, Christian, for joining us. I'll wrap it up there. So thank you to our listeners, our viewers, for bearing with us. We've had a lot of episodes at the start of 2026, but I'm sure this episode is going to be of great use. I know I've learned a lot and I've enjoyed it. So as Ray, he's poking me with a stick, telling me, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, press the hype button on YouTube. And if you've got any feedback in terms of other topics that you'd like us to discuss or people you'd like to see on the podcast, let us know.
Thank you. And we'll have Christian back on for the stand-up episode in a few weeks.
Amazing. Look forward to it.
Thanks, guys. Take care. Bye.